Hello, everybody. Welcome to UT Dallas, the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology lecture series. This is our fourth lecture for the year. Is that right? Yes, fourth lecture for the year, and it's the second lecture in our series of lectures on the theme Science, Politics, and Cultural Values, where we've had and are having a variety of speakers come to talk to us about the way that science impacts our society, our political sphere, the way that politics plays a role in and guides science, and the implications of cultural values in those interactions. This will be our last lecture for 2011. We'll have two lectures in 2012 on this same theme, the philosophers Heather Douglas and Nancy Cartwright. You can read more in your program about their talks. I am going to introduce the introducer of our lecturer, as is common academic tradition, but I will try to be brief. One of the pleasures of doing this job and having these events, beyond meeting great lecturers from outside the university, is getting to know more about the people in your own university, which is great stuff. So Fred Turner is going to introduce our speaker, professor in the Arts and Humanities at UT Dallas. And if you don't know Fred Turner, or you don't know about Fred Turner, you should, right? He's really one of the most interesting faculty at UT Dallas, I think. And it's really, it would be impossible for me to list even a small percentage, a very small slice of his accomplishments, so I won't even try. But I will tell you, he is, among other things, an accomplished literary critic, a science fiction writer in his own right, an epic poet, which there aren't too many of these days, but fascinating work, a translator, quite a good translator, a black belt in karate as well, and he's the former editor of the Kenyon Review, which is a very important literary journal. And I just discovered a connection that Fred and I have, because that review at one time published essays by a mentor of mine. So it's really nice to learn about these connections, which we don't even maybe know that we share until we dig a little deeper. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Fred Turner to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, and what a wonderful job the Center for Values is doing. I've always been interested in science fiction, and I always had a sort of the ideal science fiction writer in my head, the person that would write the kind of science fiction I wanted. And this would be somebody who was extremely learned, who was sort of an adventurer, who was a poet, who was a truly literary person, who understood the beauty of weird human situations, and especially the beauty of nature. And lots of science fiction writers have those. Well, how can I put it? Lots of them have one of those characteristics. I also wanted somebody who would be who was a real intellectual, who was a prophet, who was sort of dealing with, what is the economy going to be like in 200 years? A lot of science fiction is about, you have one big technological change, and then everything is predicated on that. But things don't happen like that. Everything happens together. As somebody who's really interested in old stuff as well as lots of new stuff. I guess I found my ideal science fiction writer in Stanley Robinson, and Stan. Stan is he's a science fiction novelist. He's a literary scholar. He is a backpacker and a kind of a closet mountain climber. And he's a futurologist. He's a visionary. He's also a surprisingly kind of devoted husband and father, which is very strange these days. He has an MA from Boston University and a PhD from UCSD. So he's somehow got both sides of the strange American equation, the brilliance of American conservatism and the brilliance of American liberalism. He has many books. He has his extraordinary Three Californias series, a deep concern with a future that heals our current economic and ecological dysfunction. The Mars trilogy, which is, I suppose, my favorite of his works, although it has a competitor. The Mars trilogy, I think, is an epic. It's a true epic. He goes at what the future will be like on all cylinders. I mean, it's economic, it's political, it's philosophical, it's spiritual in its own strange way. It's technological. I mean, he's done the homework, the nuts and bolts are right. And at the same time, there are passages in it when they're first exploring the polar region of Mars. Passages that are among the best travel writing that I've ever read, but it's travel writing about a place that I haven't been to. Lots of other novels, wonderful novels. Galileo's Dream is one of my favorites. He also turns out to be an excellent historical novelist. He's caught Galileo absolutely to a T and then turned it into something quite wonderful. One of his big questions, which is one of my big questions, is what will succeed capitalism, or perhaps what will capitalism give birth to? Capitalism is presently maybe the only known system for making the worser angels of our nature work to some degree for prosperity and the common good. What are we going to do instead? What are we going to do, or what are we going to do that comes out of that? And what is science and technology going to contribute? So it's a great privilege for me and a pleasure to introduce Kim Stanley Robinson.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, everybody who involved with my invitation here. And I must say it is a particular pleasure and really an honor to be introduced by such a great poet and science fiction writer as Frederick Turner. So thank you, Fred. I appreciate that very much. And you need to read him to know what you have here, because it's really quite something. And in fact, one of his epic poems, Genesis, is about the terraforming of Mars, which is also what my Mars trilogy is about. And I had read his previous epic poem, The New World, and so I was too scared to read Genesis while I was writing the Mars books, because I didn't want to know. And it was only when I was about halfway through Blue Mars, the third of the three, when I knew that I was going to finish no matter what, that I pulled out and read Fred's Martian epic, and it is a beautiful thing. And luckily they're congruent, and the matter of Mars is worth more than one telling. So if I'm the T.H. White, he's the Mallory, and you want to take a look. Now, I struggled with thinking how I could organize my talk to you this evening, given the title that I accidentally wrote up. And it finally occurred to me that I could present it as a science fiction scenario. And why it took me so long to come to that solution is maybe a little mysterious, but it was great when it arrived. And so what I want to do is do what science fiction does. And first, let's think about looking back from the year 2000, except now, of course, we're past that. That's the great utopia of Edward Bellamy, and he wrote that in the 1880s or 1890s. And Bellamy clubs transformed America and started the progressive political movement. Utopian science fiction has indeed changed American history in that regard. And the function of looking back from some future point is an incredibly powerful point of view. So, also, since part of this talk is about post-capitalism, there's a certain amount of resistance or impossibility to that idea. What could possibly be post-capitalist? And I think it helps to think, well, let's think about 1,000 years from now. Let's think it's the year, what would that be? 3011. Well, that's too hard in a way. But one thing you have to say right away is in the year 3011, the people on Earth will not be working in a capitalist economy. Just like 1,000 years ago, it wasn't capitalist but feudalist. In 1,000 years from now, it'll be something different. And almost everybody, even people with a kind of religious devotion to capitalism, will be willing to admit that no human system is eternal and that things are likely to change and either improve or get worse. But for my purposes here, 1,000 years is just too hard to imagine and too far out. Who knows what it'll be like then? But let's think more like even 200 years out. Say the year 2212. Because even then, we're going to be in a post-capitalist system, because the capitalist system that we are living in now is simply using up the planet and destroying it. It's unsustainable, so in 200 years it'll have to be different if we're going to be there at all. So you do make a kind of an assumption here. First you say, we will have survived. In 200 years, we'll still be here. There'll be a functioning civilization. And that's already a working assumption that makes you take some consequences out of it. And let me give you some of the features of this world 200 years from now. Our power generation will be clean and renewable. It will not be fossil fuels, because we can't burn the fossil fuels and put that carbon up in the atmosphere without turning it into a jungle planet that threatens human life. So power will be generally solar, which is really the big gorilla in the room. If we can capture solar power, the amount of power that's raining down on this planet every day on the daylight side is simply astonishing when you run up the numbers. So it'll be solar power, wind power, water, tide. Agriculture will be sustainable. It won't be fueled by fossil fuels or fertilized by fossil fuels transformed into nitrogen. It will really be, therefore, a combination of genetic engineering and organic ag. It will be permaculture. It will confound current notions of left and right, of fashionable and unfashionable. It will be a mix. And all through my talk here, I think what I'll be emphasizing is that what comes in terms of competent reaction to reality is a mix, and not a single ideology or religious position, but a mix of several that actually work. Clean transport, that means over water and in air, it's kind of beautiful. You go back to the wind, there'll be sail ships, even the container ships, as long as you're not in a hurry, could be sailing ships, gigantic clippers. Except now the sails really will be kites up there, maybe 2,000-3,000 feet in the air, catching much stronger winds. And they're already doing this. And once you decide that your pipeline of goods can cross the ocean in 4 months rather than 4 weeks, and the pipeline is moving in a consistent way, it doesn't really even matter. So wind power for ocean, wind power for air, dirigibles and balloons instead of jet airplanes, which would be more of a freakish kind of sport event. And on the ground transportation, electric, powered by solar power and then batteried over in ways that we're already developing. Place like this, living over fossil water, living off of fossil water with your gigantic aquifer. Be happy to know that desalination is a coming technology, and that really a lot of the fresh water on the planet in 200 years will be from desalination. it leaves you with a lot of salt. You can actually imagine salt as a building material, fixed and protected from water, so that buildings and many things might be built out of salt dragged out of the ocean in terms of us getting fresh water. A lot of our technology will be involved with carbon drawdown, because it is actually correct that we need to have about 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and that if we are now at, say, 390 or so. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were at 280, and we are headed towards about 450 to 560 to really, if we don't stop what we're doing right now, it could go to 1,000, but that would be so destructive to the planet that we wouldn't get there. So you can imagine wind towers that as the blades of the propellers of these wind towers are spinning, that they are also capturing a certain amount of CO2 and shooting it down, freezing it, pipelining it. Once again, frozen carbon dioxide, dry ice is going to be about as common as salt as an excess substance that we need to drag out of the atmosphere. That can happen, technologically possible. It will happen. Decarbonization also is easy through forestation and soil building, topsoil building rather than topsoil loss. So there will be work to get back down to 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That'll be part of the project of the next couple centuries. And I have to say that the argument over this is really an argument that shouldn't happen, because we now have 800,000 years of good data. And you can look at CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can look at temperature. And a graph can be made that goes back 800,000 years. And the Earth has been in an unusually stable cycle for the last 800,000 years in this regard. It's not very long in Earth's history. But in that time, it's been going between 280 parts per million and 350 and dropping back down again. And it looks just like the blade of the saw. The temperature is matched with the CO2 levels. They go up to about 350, and the temperature goes up, drops again, it goes up again. These have to do with astronomical cycles, one presumes. But then at the end of the chart, it shoots up to 380, it's headed for 150, the temperature is going to go too. And so we are in a situation where we could easily create a jungle planet and a place that we not only don't want to live, but possibly can't live. So carbon drawdown and ocean deacidification, which is another problem of carbon, that a lot of it ends up in the ocean, makes it more acid, makes it bad for the smallest creatures in the ocean, and then the larger creatures, you know how food chains work. And about a third of our food comes out of the ocean, so this is not a trivial part of the carbon problem. There may also be some geoengineering going on. There may be sulfur dioxide pumped up into the atmosphere above the Arctic to deflect some sunlight, deflect 2% of sunlight up there, and you suddenly got a much cooler Arctic. We may need that. That will be scary stuff, and yet in desperate times, people sometimes agree to desperate measures. And there are less scary methods. If the wakes of ships, the white bubbles in the wakes of ships were to last 3, 4, 10 times as long as they do before they bubbled out and turned back into blue water, that also creates an increase in the Earth's albedo, and you end up with a lower temperature on Earth. So that surfactants in ship wakes are actually a geoengineering technique. We'll come back to more geoengineering techniques later on in the talk, but in this era, 200 years from now, let's imagine that the population of the Earth is about 7 billion, and I know that's what it is now. And this will have actually come down, therefore, from a peak of perhaps 11 to 12, 13 billion. That'll be a tough time, but population can be drawn down from also. And in 200 years from now, those 7 billion will all be well off. They will all have full human rights. They'll all have food, water, shelter, and clothing and adequacy. And there will be full employment with the right to work in this entire 7 billion people. Well, I say that, and that's a science fiction exercise. It's easy to say. And at that point, maybe it's not so much science fiction as a fantasy novel. The trick in science fiction, as opposed to fantasy, is to propose one of these scenarios and then run a history from here to there that is a plausible history, that you can believe in every step of the way, including the first step. And so when you run what is physically possible as a 200-year from now utopian situation, and let's also change it from utopian, which means no place, to optopian, which just means the best place possible given where we are. And optopia is a good word to introduce to the situation. Then you have in the science fiction literature the question of the plausible history. And the plausible history involves writing a form of fictional historical fiction where you try to describe things that when the reader reads, they don't immediately say, but wait, people aren't like that, or but wait, that couldn't happen, or but wait, that's physically impossible. Try to make it as realistic as you can. And one of the tricks that I have found extremely useful is the idea that comes out of Raymond Williams, a British literary critic, the idea of the residual and the emergent. That in any cultural moment, there are residual elements from its past, and there are emergent elements that are a new thing in history. And the two of them exist in a collaboration or in competition with each other, an uneasy kind of arrangement where there's residual and there's emergent, and in any given moment, you can look at what's happening in your society and you can say, that is residual from some past era, or you can say, this is just new, we've never seen this before. And it's not a way of saying bad and good, because what is residual in any cultural moment may include some bad aspects, inequality, injustice, or whatnot, but it may also include some of the deepest goods of our lives, are residual to our Paleolithic selves. On the other hand, things that emerge, they could be beautiful new utopian possibilities, or they could be dystopian police state possibilities. So, in other words, residual and emergent is not a way of saying bad old days and good new days. It's more a way of splitting up historically and trying to make a plausible history as you run forward. So, if you accept this, and I'm going to use this for most of the rest of the talk, this residual and an emergent, that any given moment, and now we are in a capitalist moment, global capitalism, globalization. For, I think since the end of the Cold War, you can say we live in a capitalist world with a few pockets of resistance or non-development that are out there, but by and large, we are in a capitalist moment in history. Well, its residual is feudalism. Because the moment that you buy into even the word capitalism, you have bought into the entire system of thought that it is part of. And we have a version of history that goes from the pre-agricultural revolution, Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies to the first Neolithic agricultural societies with their immediate split into the classes of the warriors, priests, artisans, and serfs, the big four classes that are actually all across the world. As soon as we get into agriculture, we get those. And then the ancient empires, and then feudalism, then capitalism. Now what comes next, we have to call it X, because we don't know what it is yet, and it is still emerging. So capitalism's residual is feudalism, its emergence, let's call it X for now. And just to remind you of how useful this tool can be, if we ever, at that moment when we get to X, then capitalism will be residual, X will be what we're living, and emerging will be something that you have to call Y, which luckily we don't have to talk about tonight. Because it maybe represents some kind of harmony that we don't know about. Now, the residual feudalism in capitalism has to do with ownership. Capital itself is just the useful residue of human labor. Capital is this building and everything useful out of the human past, including our knowledge, our technology. There is nothing wrong with capital. In fact, we live with it and depend on it every day. Capitalism is the system of who gets to benefit from it and who doesn't get to benefit from it. So you have to make that distinction immediately. And the ownership system comes out of feudalism, where there was a few that controlled all of the power and wealth. There was a kind of middle management class that helped to support them, and then there were a whole lot more serfs. So there was somewhat of a pyramid with a 1% at the top, as people are saying now, and the rest below in differential situations. And the power was invested in land, but the difference between feudalism and capitalism is that it liquefied, that the basis of power went from land to, have I lost my, are you still hearing me back there? I know I changed the echo has changed, but okay. Sorry, wasn't me. It's still on. This clumping at the top, this kind of vacuuming of the legal system that allows everybody's work, the value of everybody's work, to kind of move upward and upward and upward to a position at the top, is a residual of the feudal system that we still live in. And one of the ways that I can talk about this that is a little more specific is that you need to look at the Gini figures, G-I-N-I. And what the Gini figures do is they divide up people by income into quintiles, a population into quintiles. And then they run it through a mathematical formula where you can get a single number out of it, where the maximum inequality in an economic system would be 100. That's where one person owns everything and everybody else owns nothing. And then the maximum equality would be 0. That's where everybody owns everything equally and there's nobody that owns more. It's said that the Seychelles Islands have a Gini number of 0. I don't know about that. The numbers as they run in this world right now, the social democracies of Scandinavia have Gini numbers that are in the high 20s. The banana republics that are left in South America and Africa, they have Gini numbers that are in the high 40s and in the mid 50s. And the United States has a Gini number of about 45. So really only the banana republics of this world are more unequal than the United States right now. It's also true that because capitalism does not put correct prices on the use of the natural resources of the earth, it consistently undervalues the things that we own and make. So that maybe your cell phone should cost $10,000, maybe your car should cost $500,000. Your gallon of gas should probably cost 10 gallons of gas if you were going to charge the entire cost that future generations are going to have to pay. So there is a term for this in classical capitalism called predatory dumping. If you sell something for less than it costs to make it, you are driving competitors out of business, after which you can jack the prices up because you have a monopoly in it. That's called predatory dumping. World Trade Organization calls it illegal. There are capitalist theorists that said that nothing should be illegal in a free market. But actually, predatory dumping is such a nice, powerful term. It sounds ugly. It is ugly. And it tends to toss the competition in this system out of business. And the question in this situation, and when I use this term to talk about the long-term situation, is who are we predating on? Who are we in competition with? It's the future generations. And they are not born yet. So it's very easy to kick ass in competition with unborn people because they aren't here to defend themselves. So you get predatory dumping in this system. And also in a system of inequality like we're in, with the Gini numbers in the high 40s, and for the world, the Gini numbers at the high end of nearly 60, what you get is the richest and the poorest have the worst ecological effects. The poorest people have a terrifically hard effect on the ecology of the world because of deforestation and topsoil loss. If you need to cut down those trees to feed your family that night, you will. It's happening all over the world. And so the poorest people have a harsh effect on the environment. The richest people from hyperconsumption because of using specialized materials at a great quantity compared to the rest of the world. Such that ordinary American citizens like us are using 30 times the natural resources of the peasants in India on any given year. And this discrepancy means that hyperconsumption and poverty are the two biggest ecological impacts. So capitalism has its bad effects in many ways. Now, there are people there's something magical about that word capitalism. There are people who, if you say, well, we either change the rules of capitalism or else we destroy the earth, and they say, well, we destroy the earth as the lesser of two evils. And this is a religious position, but especially since the year 2008, a lot of people have been thrown into a great disarray as to what our economic system means, how it works, and how it might be made better. So I think we're a little bit open. In terms of my own talks and interactions with people, I find that everybody's a little bit more open-minded about thinking of the future as being different than they were even back in 2007. So what about this emerging X culture? Do we see anything emerging that is not like capitalism? Well, you see open source computer programming. You see a kind of gift economy happening where people who have a sufficiency, who have what they need in terms of food, water, shelter, clothing, etc., education, healthcare, they give their work to everybody else to try to make things better. It happens a lot. So there's open source, we can call it that. There's also democracy per se, the idea that everybody in this has equal rights and equal privileges on this planet. Democracy has been emergent, of course, well, since Greece, since the Enlightenment. I mean, but a democracy has always been kind of bracketed and embattled. There are co-ops, there are cooperatives that are legal now, where everybody owns the company that they're in. There's the town of Mondragon, Spain, which is in the Basque section of Spain, where every economic operation in that city works as a co-op nested with the other co-ops, and that includes the banks, which are kind of credit unions and part of the whole system. And Mondragon has been successfully working on this system for a long time. It's also kind of true of Kerala, the province in South India. And I keep thinking back to the idea of the public utilities district, that the ownership by the public of the natural resources might be an emerging thing that did not exist back in the feudal times, unless you think of the commons as something that belonged to everybody, but really the commons belonged to nobody. So, and was easy to have enclosure. And the commons were weak, and they were quickly enclosed because they had no legal power in their own. But public utilities have a certain amount of power. Nationalization of industries that certain countries have done around this world are a way of actually saying that this resource belongs to the public. And there was a very funny essay in Science magazine where a climate scientist named Wallace Brooker, one of the best of them, suggested that carbon itself should be a commons or owned by everybody equally, that carbon was a public utility that everybody on Earth had 1/7 billionth interest in. It was published as a editorial in Science magazine and is now quite famous because it is so crazily utopian given who owns the carbon right now. So I'm interested in all these. And then also the rise of science. Science itself as a method, as a worldview, as a value, as a kind of ideology, as a religion, as a working method. I come to you as a science fiction writer not only because I'm an English major and a lover of literature, but because I am a science fiction writer. I'm interested in science as being a way forward in this world. More science, and that includes the human sciences. And of course, there it gets interesting. So, science, what is it? And what is it telling us about ourselves? Two very big questions that I'm just going to briefly bounce across the top of. It's a fully human thing. We invented it. We try to improve it. It's not an other from an out. It's not an object like the moon. Science is a kind of human practice that we invented. It's historical. And when I say science, I am talking about what in certain bureaucracies in academia we would call STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The whole complex. When I say science, I mean also our engineering. I mean also our technologies that we've chosen to develop. So I'm using it as a shorthand for that whole world. And what I say is that it started with medicine. It started with herbal women in the Paleolithic communities trying to figure out which plants would make people feel better, ameliorate their pain. It had to do with midwives and people working to reduce human suffering, and it still has that as its basic fundamental purpose. Science is in the business of trying to reduce human suffering first, and then increasing human potentiality. And it's different from the other ideologies. It is an ideology, which is to say an imaginary relationship to a real situation. And we all have ideologies, and we all need them, or else we wouldn't be able to interpret the inrush of the world's data. You need to have an interpretive value system, and that's what an ideology is. And science is an ideology, but it's different in this respect. It tries to be impersonal, and it has a certain what I call ping factor, which comes out of sonar or bats echolocation, in that having made a proposition about the world, people are like this, or gold is like this, or oxygen is like this, that having said that statement, they then try a ping and run a little experiment out into the world They get some feedback back, and then they begin to work further, so that it is a reiterative process over and over again with the ping constantly going on and collaborative, so that there's now at this point, millions of scientists have worked on the questions of building up what we can know about the world and how we can manipulate the world. It has, at this point, an immense power over the natural world that is in our grasp, which is why I can so confidently talk about a utopian future 200 to 300 years from now. We can, in fact, do it because science has become immensely powerful. And it doesn't go away unless we were to burn all the libraries of the world, like Alexandria burned. So, and I also would say that almost everybody in this world believes deeply in science. And I say this because when you are sick, you go to the doctor, and a doctor is a scientist. And that's as simple as it can be. When your life is on the line, when you are feeling crappy, you go to a scientist and say, please, help me if you can. And all the sciences are conciliant. This is a word out of E.O. Wilson, one of our greatest scientists and philosophers, really an important figure, like William James or Ben Franklin, E.O. Wilson, at Harvard right now, and wrote Biophilia. And he also wrote a book called Consilience, which attempts to make the point. All the sciences fit together in a netted system, so that first there's the physics, and the subatomic physics and the cosmology. Then there's the chemistry. Then there's the biology. Then there's the human sciences, where it immediately gets extremely complicated because we're so hard to study. But they are all conciliant with each other, so that you cannot really cherry pick from the sciences without becoming incoherent. And, we're very good at cherry picking. We're all incoherent. But on the other hand, the anti-science movement, in American culture in particular, is being made by people who run to the doctor when they're sick and who will get on an airplane to fly somewhere else, which is another great evidence of confidence in science, I must say. I like to think of the accumulated work of science in form of a cathedral, because it's multi-generational, it's big, nobody knows all of it, and everybody's working in their own little corner of the cathedral, and their life's work extends it out further, and it stays there. It's permanent work that can be passed along. And the cathedral is multidimensional, it's transtemporal, it gets bigger and bigger, it gets more and more beautiful, more and more powerful, and that's what we're working on together. And it's a good image cathedral, because then you also get the image of scaffolding, that each generation manages to build a scaffold that the next generation can step a little bit higher and work a little bit higher at the edges, at the cutting edges, at the limits of what humans know. And there's many a scientist that is trying to understand when turtles first appeared on this earth, or whether Antarctica was covered by ice 50 million years ago or 3 million years ago. And the stuff that they're trying to learn is off in obscure corners of the cathedral. You can hardly believe they're that interested in that particular thing, and yet they are. It's their obsession, it's their life's work, and the cathedral grows bigger. And it can be put to work through engineering, through technology. So, what does science tell us about ourselves? Once again, a very big question. But I'm very interested in this. So I read a lot about sociobiology. I read a lot about the Paleolithic. And here's what we know. We evolved from earlier primates. And in about the last 200,000 to 300,000 years, our brains grew by a factor of 3, even though we were doing the same thing that whole time. This is a little bit of a conundrum, almost a paradox. Why these creatures doing the same thing, 200,000 years, some of the hand axes are the same for 500,000 years. But in any case, behaviorally modern humans, well, that's only 50 to 100,000 years, but anatomically modern humans, that's 150,000 years, and we're doing the same thing for hundreds of thousands of years, same thing, and yet the brain's growing like a balloon. And so I have been insisting on this point for a long time, that this mystery is worth paying attention to, and that we might be happiest just doing what grew us. If doing those activities grew us into the creatures that we are, and now we do them, will we not kind of buzz with a certain happiness and pleasure and accomplishment? And so I'm super interested in the Paleolithic activities. And I don't mean anything really rather dreadful. I mean, walking. I mean spending most of every day outdoors. I mean cooking your own meals. I mean sex and dancing and music. And I mean grooming each other and sort of sitting down and talking face to face. It's amazing in our hyper-capitalist, hyper-consumption culture that is insisting that for you to be happy, you have to spend a lot of money to do a lot of augmented, virtual, or boosted stuff, that the happiest part of every person's day is when they've sat across from a friend and chatted over tea that they've cooked up for a half hour or an hour, and that ends up being the best part of every day. And yet we burn our lives up doing the other parts of things. So I think that science has told us very important things about what we are and what might make us happy. And happiness is an interesting question in and of itself, but let's always say that happiness and health are almost synonyms. That what we do that's healthy is also what's making us happy. And there's nobody who's unhealthy who is very happy, as almost all of us know. When you're sick, you're just not that happy. And when you're healthy, the newness of recovery of health is when you suddenly feel the idea that health itself is a kind of happiness. So there's also these modern social sciences and their studies of how we best get along with each other, and what do we want, and what makes us happy. And of course that gets so fraught because people seem to want different things. And the social scientists have a really hard time actually being hard scientists. But one of the things that they've done is let's just ask people. Let's take polls. Let's take international polls and let's talk to people who are conservative, liberal. Let's talk to people on all the continents and ask them what they want. And so there are books now, and I buy books sometimes by title alone. I see a book called Happiness Quantified. I buy that book. I mean, that's such a hilarious title that you've got to check it out, right? And so what you find are there's now happiness economics. There's happiness sociology that is trying to study this. A lot of it is located in the Dutch city of Leiden, but it's all over the world now. And here's what they find. Here's what matters to people when you ask them what they care about. This is a fairly long list. Health, social life, job, house, partners, finances. Leisure use, leisure amount, working time, education, income, children, food, water, shelter, clothing, sex, healthcare, mobility, physical safety, social safety, job security, savings account, insurance, disability protection, family leave, vacation, place tenure, the commons, access to wilderness, mountains, ocean, peace, political stability, political input, political satisfaction, religious life, sense of the sacred, spirituality, air, water, esteem, status, recognition, home, community, neighbors, civil society, sports, the arts, longevity treatments. Now here I'm getting into my science fiction edge of things I notice. But also the opportunity to become more what you are. And that's all we need, right? This list. So maybe this is a long and hard list. Maybe this is really the simplest thing in the world. What the social sciences are also making quite clear when they connect with ecology is that social justice is an extremely powerful geoengineering tool. If you want to stabilize the Earth's climate and stop the environmental destruction of the planet so that we can live on it over the long haul, one of the most powerful technologies, more powerful than putting sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere or whatever else is being proposed as geoengineering, is social justice and more equality. Less of a vertical system of a distribution of the goods like the Gini figures show. In other words, a lower Gini number approaching zero. That these are technologies for saving the earth. The first one is simply women's rights. The more women have the rights to their lives, and like any other, like any man or any other citizen on this planet, the more the population rate goes right down to replacement rate. And this has been proved in Thailand and in Indonesia and in the prosperous parts of Mexico, where replacement rates have gone from 7 women per mom, which is how demographers always rate things, down to two kids per mom within one generation. These are shockingly quick changes. And 2.2 kids per mom is the replacement rate. And a lot of Europe, Japan, United States are more like 1.8. And so you can imagine the population actually going down. But what happens is if you're thinking that population is a problem in this future of ours, then one of the fastest solutions is not only good in itself, in that it's simply a matter of human justice, but it's also very quickly helps to reduce the pressure on the earth and its resources. So economics, this term that we have, economics is a lot of things. It's a social science. It's also an astrology that tells the powerful that what they're doing is okay. Essentially, economics in our world is a way of talking about how capitalism works. In other words, it's legal analysis. It's not like physics. It's more like quantified ethics. And so we have economics that needs to be more like ecology. And this is really, when I talk about post-capitalism, I'm talking about a world where inputs and outputs are in balance with each other and are costed and priced as such, where it needs to be true that you have something that can be handed on to the next generation in the same good shape that it came to you, or even better, where there's full employment and where there's a horizontalization of power and wealth rather than the verticalization that we have now. So that an economics could be designed that was specifically and legally designed to do just that, to push towards that. Because laws are changed all the time. And so we can change the laws if we want to. We can change the system. The way the financial services industries are now seem to be in control of everybody, and day traders right now, bond traders are seeing if they can kill Italy, seeing if they can kill France. I mean, this is just a kind of a game, a speculative game to make more money for a lot of these people. Well, that could, if the laws were different, that could be changed. You could easily tax every one of these computer-generated, 10,000 trades per second type computer things that aren't even comprehensible to any of the humans operating them. You could easily tax each one of those operations a billionth of a cent, and by the end of the day, you would have them thinking differently about how they should do speculative bond trading, etc. So the most interesting ideas about economics today are not coming from economics, because economics is essentially a captured field that is a defense of capitalism. The most interesting ideas about economics come from the other social sciences that are often very critical of economics, even though they know what they're talking about. Sociology, anthropology, political science, the history and philosophy of science. A lot of times when you go to a conference that is now about economics, you get into the people from the other fields making a very cogent and pointed critiques that have suggestions for what might come next and might work better. And so that gets me back to my X with, let's think about 200 years again, this science fiction scenario, this X culture. Capitalism would be the residual, and that's an interesting point right there, because it tends to be a global system. Money has tended to be the universal solvent that melts any other competitive system. And almost anybody can be bought, it seems, in the systems that we've described so far. So if I talk about X, nevertheless, there will still be capitalism because it will be residual. X will be what is lived 200 years from now. Y will be what is emerging. And what I would like to suggest is, in this culture, the necessities of life are no longer commodities. So that food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and education are all, in effect, public utilities. And in that same world, there is full employment, that everybody has a right to work. And there's a lot of work to be done. So the residual capitalism would then, where would it be? What would it be doing? Because full employment is already a paradigm buster for capitalism, which needs unemployment in order to drive wage pressure on labor. And in any time the unemployment level drops below 5.4%, which is a little unimaginable right now, but if it were to get lower than that, then the markets would readjust to make sure that unemployment rose, because it scares the capitalist structure, and it's not any individual that even is paying attention to it, but the way the laws work, you need wage pressure, and therefore you need unemployed people. And so that really means you need fear. You need fear of being unemployed, you need fear of immiseration to drive that system. And really what's happening, I think, now in this world with the uncertainties, with the Occupy Wall Street movement and all that, is that the middle class in America also feels endangered by this, feels that unemployment could come at any moment, that nobody's safe. And what there used to be this term in an older economics discourse called the proletariat. I now read people talking about the precariat, the people who are in a precarious situation. And then that rises right up through to people making quite a lot of money. In fact, there's one more point that the happiness economics people from the social sciences have, you may have read this study, that people are happiest when they make about $80,000 a year. I don't know if you read this report in the newspapers. And I was thinking to myself, there's probably a whole lot of people around America right now that who made about $80,000 a year reading that report and thinking, if I'm the happiest person in America, this is a very unhappy country because nobody feels secure. So capitalism, however, it would still be in the system. We need markets, and it could be forced by the fact that the necessities of life were public utilities that everybody had a right to work on the margins. And what I mean by the margins are simply the toys, the games, the extras, the vacations, the superfine experiences. And what I think would happen if capitalism were placed on the margin, that the creative energy in the ability to start your own business, to possibly make more, the combination of ambition, competition, and just desire to create that exists within capitalism and has been its driving force. And you have to remember what Marx said, that capitalism was both the best thing that happened to humanity and the worst at the same time. You have to hold both those in your head. That the good parts of capitalism could be driven out into the iPods and into the vacations in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. So, a couple more questions out of the sciences that I want to go through before I end. Is this view of mine physically possible? In other words, am I talking about a decarbonization and a utopian future like Wile E. Coyote when he's chased the roadrunner off the cliff and he's in the air and he doesn't realize he's in the air, and so he's walking along in air and he's thinking everything's fine, and then he looks down and only then does he fall? Are we in that moment as a civilization, or are we still on ground where we could actually retreat? And here I look at the Sokolov wedge diagrams. You got to Google Sokolov of Princeton, and wedge diagram ought to do it for you. That if we were to decarbonize by doing everything possible that would help that cause, and started now, that we could in fact avoid more than a 2 degree Celsius rise in global average temperature. So in other words, yes, it is still possible. Now, time is kind of running short. It is sort of looking like we need to run the table, do all those things at once. And in this current political climate, the idea of running the table is a little bit hard to imagine, but not physically impossible. And that's the important thing. And then another question I think is valid for us as Americans, as middle-class Americans who in the world system are like the aristocracy, in that we have 30 times more resources to burn than a lot of Earth's citizens, is if it was equally distributed across all 7 billion, if everybody had to share equally, would we still be okay? Would we be happy? And this is an important question because really we are our habits. And one of the things that people fear about utopian thinking is that if my habits had to change, I would be so completely different that I wouldn't be me anymore. So it's a kind of a miniature death. And nobody likes that. So the question is, what would happen if everything was equally distributed across all your citizens right now? And there's 2 ways to answer this. One of them comes from Switzerland. And I loved my 2 years in Switzerland. They're very practical people. And there's a 2,000-watt society. Somebody in Basel, the Swiss have actually done the math. And they said if everybody was sharing the Earth's resources equally right now, every citizen would get the rights to about 2,000 watts of power per year. Now, as an English major, I can't translate that for you, what that means. But I've read enough about it to see that they're still living very comfortable lives in Basel, in Zurich. And of course, they have the advantage of a tremendous infrastructure in a small country. But you know what? Every place is small when it's your neighborhood. And what's interesting is that they're doing it and living perfectly comfortable lives. And I also go back to these Paleolithic values. And one of the oldest proverbs in the English language, enough is as good as a feast. And that is a powerful phrase because it's not saying that enough is as good as a feast, but a feast would be better if you could get it. It is saying that enough is as good as a feast. And really now that science is looking at the way that we live, in a lot of ways enough is better than a feast because a feast makes you sick. You end up puking the next day. You end up with obesity, diabetes, and a sense of meaninglessness in your life that comes from feast. So that actually enough is even better in terms of happiness. And The idea that enough is as good as a feast is one that all of us should be living with. And it's not very much of an American phrase these days, right? I mean, Madison Avenue doesn't really believe in enough is as good as a feast. But I believe that we do, as our primate realities, as the animals that we are, if enough includes everything that I had on the list before, that we would be fine. So between a different conception of what we need out of life to make us happy, and between the Swiss's beautiful demonstration that no matter how beautiful of a life you want, you can get it on 2,000 watts, and the rest that we are burning in America tends to be from bad tech, from bad infrastructure, from wastefulness, from inattentiveness, from a lack of necessity. And that once you begin to pay attention to all those things, over time, you can swap out your infrastructure and make it more efficient. You can make a cleaner tech, live a beautiful life, and all 7,000 be happy and fully employed. Now, a lot of this is going to require government, and we've gone through a bad 30 years, ever since the Reagan-Thatcher years of against government, that government is the problem, not the solution, that it's been hammered, and it's been a very successful propaganda campaign against it. I object. I don't get it. I like to remind us of Lincoln's beautiful formulation, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that's not just rhetoric on Lincoln's part, the rule of three. Those prepositions all mean something. Of the people, well, we govern ourselves. By the people, we're the ones doing it. For the people, we do it for our own welfare. So it's government of ourselves, by ourselves, and for our own good. It was better the way Lincoln said it, but you get my point. This is our company. If you think of it as a publicly owned nonprofit that we all own together, it's simply our company. And to whip on it, to try to shrink it, is to whip on of the people, by the people, for the people. Try to shrink the people's rights and abilities for the sake of special interests. So I speak for the government as an American, speaking for our own tradition, that our Constitution was a stupendous accomplishment, a utopian document with a lot of realism written into the balance of powers. And that this Constitution was defended in a horrific civil war to keep government of the people, by the people, and for the people operating, and that it is a damn good company. And I know this is really the wrong town to mention it, but you could kind of consider the government to be something like the Green Bay Packers. Something that we all own together and that we're proud of its accomplishments. And actually, while I'm speaking to sports teams, I want to say how beautiful it was to watch the Dallas Mavericks win back in the spring. That was all sports fans all over the world loved that great moment. So what's good is what's good for the land. That's another American, Aldo Leopold. That you do what makes the land richer and is there for your descendants, that is a very easy, powerful, ethical rule to lay on us. And at that point, what you have is 7 billion people with enough. And you have a planet that is handed on to the next generation in as good shape as it was before. Sorry. Maybe this is the climactic end to my talk getting loud. Yes, I think maybe it could be. But let's also think about one more thought of capitalism on the margin, the creative ferment. If all 7 billion people on the planet had food, water, shelter, clothing, had adequacy, were healthy, and were willing to go at the world, then the capitalism on the margins would get so creative. There'd be the extra things. A group would get together and say, well, let's go on a trip. And so they'd all attach their hot air balloon or their dirigible to one big circular unit. It would rise up into the sky and the winds would carry it off to the east. And for a month or so, you could do a little progressive dinner and go around the circle of the hot air balloons, and the storms would hit, the lightning storms. You'd go over the Himalayas, you'd go around the world, over the oceans, and come back somewhere in your own longitude and maybe have to get ratcheted back down to your original home. I mean, this would be vacation in the world of enough. What I'd like to finish with is the notion, that, especially for the students here, that the idea that the 1950s were the height of human culture and that we accidentally torched the world, and that now all you kids have to live like saints and have a lower standard of living than what we had back in those days. It's all wrong in 3 or 4 different ways that I hope my talk has elucidated. Once you've got enough, once you've got the technology growing, once you're engaged in the process of making a sustainable civilization on this planet, you've got more than enough, and you've got better than it was back in the Cold War on less. So it's more clever, it's more sophisticated, it's cleaner, it's more stylish. You have all the happiness without so much of the stupid ambition and the waste of your life doing stuff that you don't really want to do, in getting and spending and staying in a money economy that doesn't mean anything to you. We want meaning in our lives, and making a sustainable civilization, which is now an emergency task, is all the meaning we need. It's a beautiful meaning. And so, in a way, climate change and the environmental crisis, the tremendously fraught moment that we find ourselves in right now, is really just an opportunity for us to have meaning throughout our careers. It means jobs. It means meaningful work. So it extends across all disciplines. It's in the sciences, it's in engineering, it's in the humanities, it's in the arts. They all are going to be concerned with getting us through the next century alive and healthy and headed towards this, this next system, this X that I've been talking about. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. So we've got 2 mics going around. I will wait.
Hi, is this on? Oh, I guess it is. I had a question about, you mentioned sustainability as an emergency. Are you familiar with James Howard Kunstler and the long emergency, where he talks about basically his stance is that declining oil production will bring about the end of industrialized society as we know it, and that we're headed towards a very difficult time before anything gets better. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, sure. I don't know that work in particular, but here's what I've been seeing, is that peak oil isn't going to come anywhere soon enough to save us from cooking the planet, because we keep discovering gigantic new oil fields, so that what looked like peak oil, like in our time, with the discoveries in the Arctic and off Brazil and so on and so forth, means that there's actually much more oil there to be brought up than we thought. So that moment doesn't come soon enough. And then also coal. And there needs to be a distinction made. You could burn almost all the oil we could get our hands on, and you still wouldn't raise the average temperature of the globe very much. But there's very much more coal than that. And if we burned even a portion of the coal that we have left on the planet, then we do shoot off into jungle planet, and it's a problem.
I was just curious, you didn't mention the Amish or the Quakers and some of the more communal societies here in the United States. You went overseas and pointed out Seychelles and some of the others, but have you looked at microeconomies here in the U.S. and how they're operating, and are they spreading, or is that a diminishing?
Well, that's a good question, and I think these are beautiful little societies, and I think we have lessons to learn from them, but they are not scalable, and they also rely on a vision of kind of renunciation. And you know, in California, and I think all over America, we're not really into renunciation. And in fact, it's more a culture of more. And I kind of, as a Californian, I could say that the religion of fun is a very important thing, that it is important to have fun and not renounce possibility. I'd like to see the Himalayas and so on and so forth. So I'm a big fan of the Quakers' pacifism. I think that that's really important. But I don't like the refusal of technology. I actually think technology and being able to be more what you are and augmenting human possibilities and potentialities is something that is a beautiful human act in itself. So I actually am a kind of a fan of technology, and so the Amish are someone who I think have made a beautiful choice, and if it's your choice, you should be able to live it. And they do seem to embody that enough is as good as a feast, and they have enough and they're extremely happy. So they're a lesson for us that actually accumulation and the consumption of commodities is by no means the only way to happiness, and maybe not even as good as some of these other ways.
They do own everything together. Even the restaurants that they serve food to outsiders is a community shared benefit.
Yeah, and you know, I live in Village Homes, Davis, California. It's only 85 acres. It's only 1,000 people. But we own all the land together, and we grow about a quarter of our food together. So I've lived this life for about 20 years, and it's not Amish. It's more like a tweaked suburbia, but it tweaked in good ways to make it more communal, more village-like, and I can testify to a most beautiful life by getting my hands in the dirt and growing some of my food and seeing all the kids play together. So the village notion, the way that American culture has been broken off into individual units or nuclear family units, each one in their supposed castle, suburban homes all next to each other, that was a bad design and bad for people's sanity and happiness. And I grew up in suburbia, so I can testify to the loss of sanity.
In The Shape of the Signifier, the literary theorist Walter Ben Michaels exploits examples from your Mars books, actually, to prove his points and show that rocks can't possibly have language or intention. And I'm wondering what you think about that, and whether you maybe prefer a more Native American view in which rocks are really our grandfathers and all things are living and intending.
I myself would not go that far. I mean, I am a 20th century American, and I spend a lot of time with rocks in the Sierra Nevada of California, granite and older metamorphic rock that are roof pendant on the granite. I love rocks, but I don't think of them as being anything more than kind of there in a way that isn't conscious in the same way as living things. And I had to think about this because precisely of the Mars situation. Do we grant Mars intrinsic value if life is not there? Is nature rock, or is nature a way of talking about life in the universe? And I came to believe, along with a lot of philosophers, that really what we love is this biophilia, that it's life that we are part of, that life has an urge to live, and that rocks in their endurance are not, that we are their consciousness. So that the rocks of the Sierra Nevada, they're never going to tell you their story, but I'll tell you their story at, length that will bore you to tears. So this is the distinction that I make.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Can you describe some of the successful forms of government that have achieved the collective interest over the individual interest?
They're what I might call pocket utopias. Mondragon, Spain, in the Basque area of Spain, Kerala, India, the Italian city of Bologna, which has been run by a collectivist government now for about 50 years. And at that point, and I admit this is a pretty feeble selection of real-world examples, because we do live in a global capitalist society. I'm interested in Venezuela. And I say that with full awareness that Hugo Chavez might have gone too far and that he's doing things a little bit undemocratically, but I don't know. If he were actually to run a vote, the bulk of the Venezuelans, more than 50%, I think, would vote for him. So there is a problem of these populist governments that when they get so popular that they think, well, that means I deserve to be popular forever and I don't need to keep to the same constitution that we had before. And that's a bad moment in these histories. And yet nationalization, the whole effort to say that these resources are public utilities that belong to everybody together, I'm completely interested in that. And so therefore I think Cuba, despite the fact that it did not move to democracy and has made a bad mistake and is doomed to change and to failure in some senses, nevertheless, there are so many Cubans who are intensely proud of the culture that they've made on their island on their own, that I think all these have to be spoken to. But the examples are fractured and under pressure. The great science fiction writer Bogdanov, who wrote Red Star in 1905, he predicted a lot of this. He said, if you had a collectivist economy that was an island in a capitalist sea, they would manage to destroy that collectivity. And it would get weird in its defensiveness. And he wrote that in like 1905, and we saw it happen in the Soviet Union and all over in the 20th century. The stresses mean that we haven't yet seen a good collectivist society, and I don't even like the word collectivist anymore. I think post-capitalist, with the idea that capitalism would still be around, even Keynesianism, a Keynesian economy where there's a government and market forces battling each other for balance, and we live in a Keynesian economy, well, it's got a lot of potential. You need a mic, but yes.
I wanted to ask in your regarding your conversation on happiness. I've been trying to keep up with a lot of current events, and you're talking about science, and it feels like every day when I listen to the news, I'm kind of assaulted with this, news of a world that's hostile to science and hostile to a lot of these ideas. And I wonder if you have any words of advice for how to find happiness in the midst of this, because I kind of feel like a little salmon trying to swim upstream sometimes.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I got lucky and moved into a village so that I had neighbors and friends. And I also think, especially for the students here, you still get to choose what work you do. And to be able to do meaningful work and then to maximize time with friends, also hold on to your friends, because the fractured nature of our American society, where you move from job to job, and then if you don't hold on to your friends from your college life or from your previous realms, you end up going through many reincarnations that are deconnected from people, and you only get to rely on your family. And we all know family, as much as we love it, that is not sometimes the biggest pleasure in one's social existence. You need your friends, and you can make them by taking the time. When I say to students, whenever you have a choice between doing something and watching something be done, choose the doing of something. And like one time with my softball team, I said, geez, I have tickets to the All-Star game, but I got to stay and play because I have a softball game that very same night. And my softball teammates were angry at me. They thought I was crazy, and they played as if we were under pressure, and we lost the game. But the important point is that you do something rather than watch things be done by other people. And the doing of things with people in communal exercises, civil society, church life, these things are, the Dalai Lama says this so beautifully, the stuff you don't like, you can always turn your back. And a lot of the media news is a soap opera made to sell more media. It's not real, it's not important. Underneath the radar, underneath the news cycles, science continues to crunch on with medical advances, and friends continue to meet with friends. And so I don't watch TV news ever. I read newspapers to keep up with it, and I try to think, well, that's kabuki, that's, these supposed two political parties in the United States that are almost identical. I mean, let's just ignore that and go out and to go for a walk. And so there's a matter of personal choices, moment by moment and hour by hour and day by day. I'm going to do the Paleolithic thing with good dental care. I'd say the Paleolithic with good dental care. This is almost the perfect existence.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to interview Dan Yergin 3 weeks ago, and I'm happy to say you're right. We will not run out of oil anytime soon. But secondly, the best book I think he wrote was called The Commanding Heights, and it was all about the commanding heights, which is these things that you're talking about, nationalizing. It's all about the failure of those nationalizing countries in the 20th century, including the Soviet Union and China, to name the two biggest ones. who felt like they could create some utopia by having the commanding heights owned by government. What makes you think anything will change in human nature that would make collectivism, which is really what you're talking about, of course, better than individual rights and human freedom?
Well, no. I would say not collectivism. I would say democracy. And here's where we get into word games that are code words for entire ideologies in the American battle. If you call it democracy, if you call it government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and if you admit that governments, when they actually gather their taxes and then expend their funds on projects, they're always hiring little private businesses anyway. So it's a Keynesian situation. The whole demonization of government is just a ploy on the part of business to get fewer regulations and bigger profits. Government in itself is in the democracy is of the people, by the people, for the people, if you can hold on to it. Might get bought by somebody, might get taken away, has to be fought for. But it's still a question of us deciding what we want to do for us. And also, we write the laws in a democracy. Now, China's a different situation. And it is a little bit embarrassing that a command economy is now kicking our ass in the world competition. But they're doing it partly by wrecking their environment. They're doing it unsustainably, even worse than we are. And when you look at the resources of China versus the United States, and you just add up money right now or debt, they look like they've got it all. But we've got clean water, clean air, because of the regulations that our government put in place. So we actually have a stronger country if you go right down into the soil. And they are poisoning their country so badly that in the next 20 or 30 years, they're going to have to completely change everything, and they're going to realize that their rather small patch of the Earth's surface is not functional and is poisoning them. So, I mean, I don't want to get in too much of a political battle, and I sort of sense that I'm an American leftist, and you might not be an American leftist. Yeah. But I think, but what I would hope is that as Americans, we can actually discuss this stuff without not only without guns coming out, which is really the definition of a polity, that we can discuss these things, but even that insults and misunderstandings might not necessarily be the first things that comes out, but actually a dialogue. And the political battles, they happen, votes are made, things get done, and the losing side says, okay, well, we need better education, we need 3% more votes, and we go on and on and on. I have to say that, you know, I'm in Bar Harbor, Maine on 4th of July, and the population fills the streets. There's 10,000 people there. There isn't a policeman in sight. And we live in a peaceful country. You have to think about that. Because peace is not to be taken for granted.
This may be shifting gears a bit, but I've noticed from the biographical note in our
I'm sorry.
I've noticed in the biographical note here in our pamphlet that you wrote your dissertation on Philip K. Dick.
I did.
Could you touch on how that influenced you as a writer and your ideology, how he influenced you?
Sure. Philip K. Dick was a very, very crazy science fiction writer, and he did not believe that this reality was the ultimate reality, that at any moment you might just fall through the floor into a more fundamental reality. So he was an extremely metaphysical guy, and I don't have any agreement with that. I am a this world guy. But all of his protagonists were the little repair person. The guy that put new strips in bald tires, the guy that glued back together broken pots. And in the science fiction world that he began to write in, where it was all about superheroes doing magical things, he was a touch of realism in science fiction that was very, very important. So that's what I take out of Philip K. Dick. And he was a Berkeley guy, he was a Southern Californian, and so I take him to be an aspect of California literature, you know, very crazy, very much a liberal and American left, IWW, Wobblies, the general strike, the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, that he was part of that American movement, a progressive. And so this is what I take out of Philip K. Dick.
I think we have time for one more question. Sabrina, do you have the... Yeah, this guy here.
Here comes a mic.
I would like to learn about your opinion. You mentioned that 2.2 is the basically the reproduction number that actually brings a sustainable population. But we are way exceeding that one. And it will reach to a point that probably the Earth resources will not really sustain, and we may see a very sharp drop. And what will happen to the economy at that point? Because the economy, from your definition as well as that we know, is equal to consumption of goods, service, environment, and that is basically relying on a sustainable population. What will happen if it drops? I mean, is it the Y point that you don't want to talk about, an abrupt correction?
Well, that's a very good question, and it is a complicated issue because there are economists who will argue that we need permanent growth and that we need also permanent growth of the population. And at the moment that we get a shrinking economy or a shrinking population, the economic problems, the money problems will be so horrific that we'll have to change. And at that point, I think we'll change. Yeah, Japan has that situation now. Now, it's a weird thing because first of all, we have an aging population that needs care, and then we have a coming generation that needs work, and the youth are unemployed, and the old are in need of care. I see a solution, you know? And I think that what will happen is we'll change what's paid for, what's important. That social work will be a way to make a living rather than a way to be in genteel poverty. That social work will become important work of taking care of the old and the young. And it would be good, I think, if we began to realize that the Earth can't support 50 billion people. And it's a question how many, what the carrying capacity of the Earth is in human terms. It's actually an open question because it depends completely on consumption levels and how clean your technology is. So then you look at the IPAT formula and you begin to think about this. But in Europe and in Japan, we have the declining populations, and in Russia, for different reasons having to do with health problems. And they will have peculiarities of demography that will take inventive new economics. But since economics is just legal analysis, since economics is not physics, it's not written in the cosmos, it's not what electrons do, it's what legal systems do and what money systems do, we can change those to fit the circumstances. And I believe we will, because nobody's, very few people are tied to an idea more than they are to their kids. So when you begin to contemplate what's good for your kids, what's better for your kids, and you want to think about passing along a world to them that is as good as the one you were in, then the ideas begin to shuffle around. Let's make the ideas fit the need rather than the need get deformed to the idea. So that's going to be an interesting question, though, and is constantly under discussion. There's a very good economist named Shyam Sunder, S-U-N-D-E-R, from Yale School of Forestry, but he's an economist, and he writes about this in tremendously interesting ways. He was from India originally, but if you Google S-U-N-D-E-R and Yale, you'll get him, and he's much better on this than I am. As so often happens.
Okay. That seems to me to be the perfect place to stop. So join me in thanking Kim Stanley Robinson.